We know that you speak to us through your word. It's a light to our path. It helps us make better decisions. It helps us be the kind of people you want us to be. It makes us wise unto salvation and gives us a wisdom that we can pass on to other people that they so desperately need. So because of all that, and we know the blessing it is that you've given it to us, we just ask your help as we try to understand it better, and that it might sink in and we might remember it better as well. That's my request in Jesus' name. All right, Acts chapter 21. This is one of those passages, even as I'm praying, I'm thinking to myself, one of the things that you hope, and one of the things that I think is helpful when you study the Bible, that after you've studied the Bible for a while, you can kind of, there's a lot of good helps, and you can always look things up, but it's kind of good to know just some general things, like if somebody wants to talk about the history of the church, go to the book of Acts, right? And if you want to talk about the conversion of Paul, we're going to, in one of those chapters, there's 3 different chapters in the book of Acts. Chapter 9 is the first time. Here we are we're going to be up to chapter 22. Chapter 21 is where we are tonight, but in chapter 22 is the second time that Paul's conversion, and then we'll have it the third time over in chapter 26. But there are just I'm hoping as we go through this, there will be some mental markers, right? Like chapter 13, 14 would be the first missionary journey. Chapter 15 would be the Jerusalem Council, where they all come back together. Chapter 20, we talked about last week, that's when Paul meets with the elders. So it's a great chapter to talk about what should church leadership look like, right? So there's just different mental markers that you make as you go through. Chapter 21 is there are some chapters that are just full of so many different things that sometimes it's hard to make mental mark with it. But chapter 18 would be Corinth, and then chapter 19 would be Ephesus and the riot that takes place there. Well, we're going to have another riot tonight when we get into the 21st chapter. But this would be the guys who are some of the best at rioting. It'd be the Jews.
Of course.
Right? And it's gonna sound very similar. And I didn't bring it with me tonight, but there's one commentary that I really enjoy. There's a couple really good commentaries on the book of Acts. There's one by Gareth Reese, and it's kind of the one we grew up on, and it's a great big old fat commentary on the book of Acts. But one of the really neat things about Gareth Reese's commentary is it's old, and so you can buy used copies of it, like on Amazon for dirt cheap. But he's also got all these special studies. So he doesn't just go through the book of Acts. He'll stop and have 10, 15 page, 20 page special study, like on speaking in tongues, or after the second chapter, or on laying on of the apostles' hands, and stuff like that. So highly recommend it. But the one I was reading this afternoon, actually this morning, just kind of refreshed my memory on some of this stuff, was Mark Moore's. He's got a great commentary on the book of Acts too. And he was talking about the parallels here, what we're going to see with Paul and the Jews, and how much it's like Jesus and the Jews. In fact, what Jesus' trial at the end of his ministry that led to the cross, there's a lot of similarities in what the Jews did with Jesus with what happens in the seventh chapter. Seventh chapter of Acts would be Stephen. And that's a great chapter to remember too, because if you want the entire Bible summarized in one chapter, Stephen does a pretty good job of it, right? He preaches this one sermon. It's a long sermon, 7th chapter, but he kind of reviews all Jewish history up to that time. But the way they treated Jesus at his trial is the way they treat Stephen before they stoned him, and it's the way they treat Paul. And they tried to kill Paul. But the Romans come in and stop that, and it's going to prolong Paul's life. And Paul's going to take advantage of that, because every time Paul gets an extension on his life, it's not like, okay, great, I've got another extension on my life. It's like, great, I got another opportunity to preach to people about Jesus. That's like every opportunity. And one of the things that's going to be just so obvious to us when we get to this is when he has an opportunity to say something in his defense, it's kind of like, okay, here's what I want to say in my defense. Let me talk to you about Jesus. Yeah. And so it's like, Paul, you could say something that would get you off the hook, but he'd rather use that time to try to convert people that he's talking to. And part of you wants to shake him and say, if you just got out of jail, you'd be able to talk to more people. But he wants to use those opportunities. So not only do I admire that, I take it as a point of conviction. Do I look at I've been frustrated the last couple of days dealing with some people, and it's kind of like, do I look at that as an opportunity to tell them about Jesus, or do I just get frustrated with the administrative stuff that you know what I mean? Everything can be an opportunity of sorts that we can use for him. So with that in mind, let's set the stage here. We're going to get to Jerusalem, and things are not going to go well in Jerusalem, and he knows before he goes it's not going to be well. He's warned ahead of time, right? Yep. So let's start with, let's get the first 3 verses and just kind of set the stage on the trip to Jerusalem.
Verse 3, okay. After we had torn ourselves away from them, we put out to sea and sailed straight to Kos. The next day we went to Rhodes, and from there to Patara. We found a ship crossing over to Phoenicia, went on board and set sail. After sighting Cyprus and passing to the south of it, we sailed on to Syria. We landed at Tyre, where our ship was to unload its cargo. Yeah, because that ship, the one that was going to Phoenicia, all these other ones to Kos and to Rhodes, it's 50 miles, 75 miles, another 75 miles. But the one crossing to Phoenicia, that'd be 475 miles. Mm-hmm. So probably little, with planes, you call them puddle jumpers, probably the little ones, and then probably boarded the big ship that goes around Cyprus and goes all the way to Phoenicia. And the most famous port of Phoenicia would be Tyre, mm-hmm. right? And it has a long history, clear back to the Babylonian period and before, as being a kind of a city-state on the Phoenician coast. Well, even at this point, it's an important port, and that's where they're going to land, and then they're going to go on down to Jerusalem from there. But notice the way this opens. It's just the trip, and he's detailing the different ports that they go to. But it says we had torn ourselves away from them. Torn ourselves away from who? Remember where we were last week? Yeah, the elders from Ephesus.
The elders from Ephesus. They're at Miletus, not Ephesus. Why are they at Miletus?
Well, Paul didn't want to have to go through there because he'd never get out.
Yes. Paul purposefully went past Ephesus and sent back so the elders would come down and meet him at Miletus, because he knew he wanted to get to Jerusalem. And if he went back there, it's like the people's home that you only wanted to visit 15 minutes and you're there for 5 hours. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like every time you get up, they're holding onto your hand and pulling you back down. And it's, one of those kind of things where it's just hard to tear yourself away. And here, even though the elders come down to Miletus to meet him there, it's still hard to, I just like the expression. It's very descriptive in my mind as far as tearing yourself away from these people. And by the way, what was the thing that bothered them the most? You remember? Yeah, never see him again. So it's kind of like, if you knew this was the last one and Paul just told you this is the last time we're going to meet, then it's like, well, then, Paul, can't you just stay a little bit longer? Mm-hmm. Right? Doesn't this make you think of the story at the end of the book of Judges? At the end of the book of Judges, there's a guy who, it's his concubine, but also his wife, and she runs back home, and when he goes back home, his father-in-law, he says, okay, I need to get home. And he says, oh, no, just eat one more meal. And he eats one more meal and he says, oh, it's too late for you to go now. Mm-hmm. Spend the night. So he spends the night and he says, I'm going to go in the morning. Oh, you can't go until you eat. And then he eats in the morning. He says, well, at least stay for dinner. He says, okay. And he says, well, you can't go now. Let's spend another night. He ends up spending 3 more nights. And it's kind of like the way the story's told. It's kind of like, wow, maybe it's one of these kind of settings because they just didn't want to see him go. So, after that, he's actually, the beginning of the 4th verse, we're going to have verses 4, let's have verses 4 through 6. But as you read this, when it says we sought out disciples there. So as he goes, every now and then Luke will give us some details, and we'll talk about they stay in certain places because they stayed 7 more days. Why? To be there the first day of the week so they could break bread, so they could have communion with the church. That was back at Troas, wasn't it, when they stayed 7 more days? Yep. Okay. Well, here, this term for sought out, Luke only uses this expression 2 times. The only other time he uses this expression, it's not the normal It's not the normal Greek word for seeking or looking for somebody. It's kind of a stronger word. And the only other time Luke uses this is back in the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus' parents were looking for him when he was 12 years old. Can you imagine? That means a lot to me, because I don't know if you ever had this experience. I lost Seth when he was a little guy. And oh boy, did I panic, because we lived in a place where there was a river on that side and there was a highway on that side. And he was just a little guy, and he was an uncontrollable little guy. And so I was afraid he's up there in the street or he's down there. And so when I ran down there, as I'm running down there, I'm thinking to myself, but he's that way. And so I run that way. And I'm like, no, he's down that way. And boy, you talk about it. Man, it was terrible. Franklin.
I remember Franklin, but I don't remember you losing something.
Okay, well, maybe I kept that a secret from Lori.
Don't tell Mom. Yeah, I can just see it now. Don't tell Mom.
Yeah, but anyway, that very strong phrase, this word that he uses there, the only other time he used it is when Joseph and Mary discover, on the second day going back home from Jerusalem from the feast, that Jesus is not with them. So they spend a whole day going back, and they sought Jesus. They were searching all over for him. But with that same kind of fervor, if you will, they want to find more Christians. So verses 4 through 6.
We sought out we sought out the disciples there and stayed with them 7 days. Through the Spirit, they urged Paul not to go on to Jerusalem. When it was time to leave, we left and continued on our way. All of them, including the wives and children, accompanied us out of the city and there to the beach where we knelt to pray. After saying goodbye to each other, we went aboard the ship and they returned home.
Yeah, okay. I find it very interesting, not just that they sought them out, and that's always important, but why did they stay 7 days? Especially knowing in the chapter before he wouldn't go to Ephesus because he was in a hurry. And they tore themselves away from these other people because they had to get on their journey. And here they stay 7 days. Any guesses as to maybe why?
It was to
Underground.
be there for the Lord's Supper. I can't imagine.
I'm thinking the same thing, because 7, why do you think of 7? That's a full week. So maybe they got there too late for the regular meeting of the church. They sought out the disciples, but they wanted to stay around until they could have communion with them again and participate in their service. If that's the case, this is the second time it's happened. We know specifically it happened the first time. This is probably the second time it happens. And if that's the case, that just really impresses me. These guys, at the beginning of the church, they start churches all over the place. And every time they meet, of course, they're talking with people about the Bible and everything. But to them, this meeting of the Christians the first day of the week was super important. It was super important. I had a conversation with a gentleman this past week, and he said he was talking about not going to church very often, but he meets with Christians, and they read the Bible together, and they do all sorts of that. And I'm thinking, yeah, all that's good. But the emphasis of the Bible was Christians made it just a real point. And maybe one of the things is 1 Corinthians chapter 11 says that when you meet to have the Lord's Supper, it says you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Okay, what does that mean? I think it means a lot of things, but one of the things is you're making a statement to people. They know that this is really important to you, that you can't pry them away from meeting with the other Christians, because you are making a statement with other people, such as the whole family's taken off on a trip and they're leaving early Sunday morning, and you say, okay, Sunday afternoon I'll start on the trip and I'll meet you. Well, why aren't you leaving when everybody else leaves? Because I'm not going to do that, because I'm going to go to church first. You know what? You're making a statement to your family. You're telling them that this is something extremely important. And the reason I belabor this a little bit is, just my opinion, I don't think we stop and think about that very often. And I wish we did. I wish we thought about the impression we're having on family members and on friends and things of that nature. People who don't know us that well, it's one thing to say, well, I'm not going to go work out on Sunday, because I'm going to be at church or whatever. I don't know if that makes an impression on the guys at the gym or not. but I still want to say it. You know what I mean? Just to try to make some sort of statement as whatever we can. It's just before that's definite. I think it's probable here because they're in such a hurry, but they'll wait 7 days, right? In all likelihood, it's because they're waiting to have that special first day of the week meeting with them again. I also like the fact that he mentions the women and the children come out with them, which in the first century, that was really unusual. But the church really emphasized family. The whole family participated in this. And the other thing that I find very interesting is they kneel to pray at the beach. Okay, this is just a quick aside here, but I think this is important. Sometimes we associate kneeling with prayer, right? Other cultures, I am very much impressed with this with Asian cultures. You're very careful before you kneel. And when somebody kneels, if somebody comes up to you and they want to apologize, but they actually get down on their knees to apologize, a lot of times in the Asian cultures, people will grab and say, "Don't do that." Stand up. Why? Because that is the ultimate humiliating thing to do. It's kind of like, I'm kneeling before you. I treat you as somebody that's superior to me. The reason that jumps out at me is because in English history, people used to pray like this. Do you know why they prayed like that? Do you know the history of that? Because in English history, when people used to surrender, they didn't surrender like this, putting your hands up. This is the way you surrendered. You put your hands out like that so people could tie you up.
Yep.
So when they came to God, this was natural for them to say, "Here you go, God, I surrender," which I think is really neat. And so I wonder from other cultures if maybe the kneeling wasn't a sign of, "God, here you are. I humbly submit myself to you." Sometimes, in all honesty, I just kneel so I can focus more on my prayer. It's kind of like bowing my head, right? But if I would think of some of the other cultural significance associated with that, I think maybe it would make it a little more rich because I did this when I was teaching little kids years ago. We went through the Bible and we looked at all the different postures in prayer. And you'll see Elijah sat down and put his head between his knees when he prayed. You have examples of people laying flat on their face when they pray. And usually when you look at the circumstances, it makes sense because it's at a time of great distress. And so you have no energy. You lay flat, right? But sometimes there's significance in it. The reason I mention this is that lesson I taught it was in junior church of the little kids. There was a lady in the church, Wendy Wilson. She was teaching the next hour. And after church was over, she came up to me and she said, "What in the world did you teach those kids today?" I said, "We just talked about the postures of prayer." And she goes, I don't remember the kid's name. I'll call him Robbie. She goes, she asked the kids, "Does somebody want to pray?" And Robbie says, "Yeah, I'll pray." And she said he pulled out a chair and he stood up on the chair and he lifted his hands like this and he said the prayer at the beginning of class. And I'm like, "Well, yeah, that was Solomon. Solomon got up on his Isn't that just like a little kid learn something and you can pray in a bunch of different ways? And so
You're lucky he didn't go out down on the ground stretched out. That's what I thought he was going to do.
No, standing with I guess. Yeah, that was one of the prayers, the Pharisees, it's kind of like, that's not the kind of prayer, draw attention to yourself kind of thing. So.
Well, a quick aside on that, on prayer postures.
Yes.
The shape of the pretzels was developed because of the way they prayed, and that was to encourage the kids to put their
I didn't know that.
Shoulders crossed like that.
I think I'll go home and eat some pretzels.
Yeah, so when you see that pretzel shape, I can't remember if it was a monk or a priest, but he developed that as a reward to teach the kids.
Bavarian or German.
Yes.
Yeah, there's just
has to be.
German.
It's just a reminder to me. Sometimes I read through things and I just blow right by them. In other cultures, sometimes I think I did tell you this. I hope I did. When we were going through the book of Romans, in I believe it's Romans the 8th chapter, where it says one of the blessings God gives to us is He declares us His sons. And some translations will say sons and daughters. And there was a lady, and I think she was from Vietnam, but she was part of the church, and the preacher, you remember this? She said to the preacher, "Don't you dare change that," because the Bible just says sons. And instead of trying to make it all inclusive, she said in her culture, daughters have no rights. And one of the things you want more than anything else, you want to have the rights of a son. You don't have the rights of a son or a daughter. As a lady, she said, this is just because God's going to treat me like a son, right? And so there was some significance there that in our culture we kind of miss because we're trying to be inclusive, and we miss the point that the Bible's really talking about. So some of these little details, I think, are kind of neat. So verses 7, let's go 7 down through. Oh, I did want to mention the other thing, though, is through the Spirit they urged him not to go. Yeah, they urged him not to go. And so did he listen to him? No. Okay, we're going to see this down in verse 11. So let's go ahead and have verses 7 through 11, because this is, which, by the way, Paul's human. Even though he's an apostle, he can make mistakes. And so it's possible that he's doing something wrong. I don't think he's doing something wrong. Okay? But I do want to put the pieces of the puzzle together. So let's go verses 7 down through 11.
Okay, we continued our voyage from Tyre and landed at Ptolemais, where we were greeted by the brothers and sisters and stayed with them for a day. Leaving the next day, we reached Caesarea and stayed at the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the 7. He had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. After we had been there a number of days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Coming over to us, he took Paul's belt, tied his own hands and feet with it, and said, "The Holy Spirit says, in this way the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles."
Yes. And you know what? We can't finish there. Let's go ahead and have verse down through 14.
Okay. When we heard this, we and the people were pleaded with Paul not to go up to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, "Why are you weeping and breaking my heart? I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." When he would not be dissuaded, we gave up and said, "The Lord's will be done."
Very good. Okay, the point I want to make here is it seems as though what the Spirit is telling them is Paul's going to suffer. That's the message of the Spirit. So it's their interpretation. If you're going to suffer because the Spirit has told us that, then don't go. And Paul's point is, I know I'm going to suffer. Let me go, right? So it's not that he's rebelling against what the Spirit says. It's what they want to do because of what the Spirit says, right? And it just makes me think of, again, I don't want to sound heartless here, but hopefully you guys know me well enough that sometimes I am heartless. So, but there are many times where people will ask me and will say, "Hey, my dad's sick, will you pray for him?" And I'll say, "Sure." But on the inside I'm saying, "And what do you want me to pray?" Because I know most people want me to pray that Dad gets better.
Right.
But I also know that's not always what God wants, right? And so I'm careful who I say what to, but it just makes me think. Paul's like, okay, I'm going to suffer there, and you think, then I shouldn't go. But I think I'm going to suffer there, I should go, right? Because he knows what he's going to accomplish while he's suffering. I'm sorry, but I just so appreciate the eternal perspective. It's like, okay, they killed me. I did what I was supposed to do, right? Right? This is really brought home to me because yesterday, and I get to go over and teach the Bible college over there. And one of the things we were dealing with is a couple passages in the Bible where it talks about death, and especially death of children sometimes is a blessing. And it just reminds me, okay, think about this. Stop and think about this. When somebody's a Christian, or especially when it's a young child, what happens to them when they die?
Go to heaven.
Yeah, and I realize that there must be heartache and loss, but it's kind of like, no, I don't want my child to experience the greatest thing that's ever possible for them to experience, because I want them to be with me more. You know what I mean? That's one of the things that you wrestle with. But if you just stop and thought about the fact that what we're facing here And Paul is the very one who said it in the book of Philippians. If I die, great. If not, I'm going to keep serving the Lord here, right?
I have to confess, I'm watching TV last night before going to bed, and on that channel, I'm always seeing it. It's St. Jude's Hospital, and how
Yes.
save the children, and so forth. And all
Yes.
I could think of at one moment was, well, it might be better for some of them if they didn't have to go through this life. I'm not. That sounds awful,
Yeah.
but I'm thinking to myself, if we rescue them.
Yeah.
And they go on to become an adult and never become a Christian. I don't know which was worse.
Yes.
I don't know. Maybe that's just the
we
wrong
always
way
do
to look
good
at it.
and we leave. We
Yeah.
trust God for those things. But when they do die,
Yeah.
we do know that as a child they are innocent in the eyes of God. To be absent from bodies, to be present with the Lord, right? But that makes me think of a guy named Hezekiah, good King Hezekiah, but he found out that his days were numbered. And he was going to die. So he really prayed that he could live a little bit longer. And to me, this is just such again, I'm sorry if this sounds heartless, but that just sounds like, yep, that's what most people pray for. Get sick. The first thing they pray for is, I want to get well, I want to live longer. And I'm not critical of that. I understand that. But in Hezekiah's place, he got 15 more years. You know what happened? He fathered a child who ended up being the worst king that God's people had ever seen. The worst king. And it's kind of like, you got 15 more years, and what happened? It wasn't good. It wasn't good. And so, hopefully, if God gives us 15 more years, it's going to be fruitful, and it's going to be stuff that's, you know what I mean? But Paul's whole attitude is, how much ever time God gives me, whatever the opportunity is, I'm going to try to live it for the best for God, instead of just having more time. Okay. Anyway, I didn't want to skip over these other things, but I wanted to answer that question as far as what did the Spirit say? Specifically, the Spirit was telling them that he was going to suffer, and Agabus here even has the visual aid. He's going to be tied up, and it is going to be awful for Paul. But I love the way, and again, it's a strong Greek word that's used here when he says, you're breaking my heart. It's not really, he doesn't really say you're breaking my heart. He uses some words that says my heart is pounding. You're making my heart go like this. And so it's kind of like, it's a very emotional time for Paul, because obviously he loves these people and they love him. But it's like, come on, I've got to do this.
Like an anxiety attack.
Yeah. Okay, back up in verses 8 and 9. We've met Philip before when it says that he's an evangelist and one of the 7. Remember who the 7 are?
Yeah.
So he's not only an evangelist, he was a deacon, because he was set aside back in chapter 6. In chapter 6, he's one of the 7 and 6. Chapter 6, but he's one of the 7 who, because the apostles didn't have time to oversee the distribution of food, right? Because the Grecian widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. And so they chose amongst themselves, and they chose these men of great reputation, and he's one of these guys, but he's also an evangelist. And as an evangelist, he worked with the preaching and teaching, and probably helped with a lot of different house churches, because that's where most of the churches would meet in the first century, would be in different homes.
Well, he's the one that met the Ethiopian eunuch, right?
Yes.
So he must have been a lot younger. I'm thinking a lot of time's gone on. Now he must be married and he's got daughters. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
Everything keeps moving along.
We're not sure how old he was when we first met him, but yeah, this would be at least 15 years later. So 15 years later. And I do want to comment on his 4 daughters, because this is interesting, and I'll just be honest with you. Some of the stuff I read today maybe gave me pause, because it talks about he has these unmarried daughters who prophesied. The thing that gave me pause is this, it was Mark Moore again, I think it was him, but he made the comment. He says there's one ministry that we in the modern church try to talk people out of more than any other ministry. It's the singles ministry. And he says we tend to see single people as projects of people that we need to get married off. And
Not what Paul
he reminded me of Matthew the 19th chapter, where Jesus says, some people have chosen to live that kind of life for the purpose of being able to serve God better. And in fact, Paul even makes that point in 1 Corinthians the 7th chapter. He says it's not good for some people not to be married. That's problematic for some people. But there are some people, if they can handle it, it's actually better because they don't have the natural worries and concerns that comes along with the family. And families are blessings, but they also take your time. And there's a lot of things associated with that. And some people, to use 1 Corinthians the 7th chapter, if they don't burn, if they don't have sexual desires, because that led to a problem in the history of the church. And it's not just the history of the church. I want you to know this. It's a bigger problem in Buddhism than it ever was in the Catholic Church. But sometimes this idea of you have to be single was forced upon some people that should have never been single because they never could control their sexual desires. And as a result of that, you've all heard of what's happened in Catholicism, right? Well, that's a huge problem with Buddhist monks. If you remember, what's the guy, the missionary to Thailand, Garland Bear, talking about that? It was like, oh my. You don't even want to think about that. So most people with their natural desires need to be married, but not everybody does. And if somebody can remain single, and Mark Moore went into the background of this unmarried daughters, the word literally means, I don't know what your translation says, but it doesn't say unmarried. The Greek says virgin daughters.
Yeah.
Virgin daughters. And it emphasizes the idea that they are remaining that way probably on purpose so they can continue in their ministry. What ministry do women have in the church? They have quite a few things that they can do, but their main ministry of women is to other women. In fact, that's one of the things that always gets me with Titus, not so much Timothy, but with Titus. Paul tells both Timothy and Titus, you're supposed to treat older men like your fathers, older women like your mothers, younger men like brothers. And to Timothy, he says, younger women he goes overboard to say with extra caution, like sisters. But to Titus, he doesn't even mention the younger women. He just says, older women like mothers, older men like fathers, younger men like brothers. He doesn't mention younger women, as if to say, don't you mess with the younger women. Why? Because the older women are responsible for taking care of the younger women. And even though I'm an old guy now, even as an old guy, frequently when women want to talk to the preacher, I'll always say, well, my wife's going to be there, or you can talk to my wife. And sometimes people are like, well, no, I want to talk to you. And I'm like, sorry, you're going to talk to my wife. Because there's so many reasons for this, sorry. But as a dad, one of the things that was always impressed me, raising my boys, it wasn't without difficulty, but I always knew what my boys were thinking. I could never figure out what my daughters were thinking. I knew my daughters were playing me sometimes. I knew it. And so it was kind of like, Lori. So, anyway, that's parenting, but even in general, I really do think that women understand women better, men understand men better. It's just, that goes both ways. Okay. I didn't want to skip over anything else, but I think that's the main point I wanted to hit there. Let's pick up verses. Let's get, verse 15 through 19.
Okay. After this, we started on our way up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea accompanied us and brought us to the home of Mnason, where we were to stay. He was a man from Cyprus and one of the early disciples. When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry.
Very good, very good. Okay, can't help but to say they're traveling 75 miles here from Caesarea down to Jerusalem, but it says up to Jerusalem because they didn't care so much north and south. It's not like they were in a car. They were walking, and you had to go uphill. And so you'd always, even if you're traveling south, if it was, that's going to be a harder 75 miles if you're going uphill, right? Notice the very people who eventually said God's will be done, but they were the very people who said don't go. Did you notice they went with him? I love that, because it's kind of like Paul's like, no, you're breaking my heart. I'm going to go anyway if it's tough. It's like, okay, if it's tough, then we're going with you. I just love that. I just love that. This Manson that's mentioned here as far as being an early disciple, this earliness here, the very fact that he talks about early disciples probably means this is one of the guys who started following Jesus before Jesus went to the cross. So this is probably one of the people that, because this would be, we're coming up to the late 50s, early 60s. So he's probably been a disciple for 35 years now and probably saw the Lord. And it makes you think when Paul writes a church at Corinth and he talks about all the eyewitnesses, he says many of them are still alive and you can go talk to them, right? This may be one of those guys early. Okay, so when they get to Jerusalem, they receive them warmly. And James is one of the elders. He was one of the leaders that spoke up back in chapter 15 at the council, right? And it's kind of like, I can't help but to think of returning missionaries coming back and giving their reports, right? We're always so anxious when Ford comes back from Samoa. I know he's a Samoan, but he's one of us. You know what I mean? And so when he comes back from Samoa, I expect to hear great stories. Because as a Samoan, I expect him to do what it would take an American a year to do. I expect him to do it in 2 months, right? Because he's got shorthand with his own people. And boy, does he. He doesn't pull any punches, with his own people and stuff like that. And as a result, he's really had some really effective things as far as the kingdom goes. I'm going to announce it this Sunday, but he's planning another trip and he's already bought his tickets. And he's going to be gone from... He's leaving on June 2nd, and he's going to be gone till Labor Day. So 3 months he's going to be over there. And he's already lined up several churches and church leaders where he's meeting with groups of them. So he had a lot of good things happen last time. I hope he was able to build on that. Okay, verses 20 down through 25.
Okay. When they heard this, is it my turn? I can't
Yes.
remember which one. Okay. When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses, so they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from meat strangled, from blood, from meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality."
Yes, and that's
hard to say.
That's a third time he repeats that, because 2 times in chapter 15 they decide to write a letter to the Gentile believers, and these are the 3 guidelines they give them, and then they actually read the letter. So it's stated twice in chapter 15, and then Luke repeats it here, and it's the same group. It's back in Jerusalem that are saying this. So it's kind of like they're saying, we don't expect Gentiles to become Jews. That was the ultimate decision made in the Jerusalem Council. We're saved by grace, and you don't have to obey the Old Testament law. But if you're a Jew, of course you've got some Jewish customs, and if that's the way following these customs, that's fine, but we don't expect Gentiles to do that. But it doesn't mean there aren't standards you have to live by, right? You're not saved by works, but you still are supposed to do the things that God wants you to do. So they set out these 3 things for the Gentiles. But the Jews are hearing these reports that Paul is actually telling the Gentiles to reject all of Judaism. So they're misunderstanding. It's a fine point, but it's an extremely important point. And that's why they spent so much time back in chapter 15 making sure people understood. You're saved by grace. You're not saved by observing the law, regardless of what the law is, even if it's the Old Testament law. That doesn't mean that Jews shouldn't keep the Old Testament law. They just need to understand that's not what saves you, right? Having said that, in chapter 16, before Paul goes around and starts talking to Jews and brings Timothy along with him, one of the first things he does is he has Timothy circumcised. Now, why would he do that? Because he doesn't want to offend the Jews. But he just made the point, you don't have to be circumcised. That's true, you don't. And that's what he's going to preach. You don't have to be circumcised. But why offend people if you don't have to?
Yeah, because then it's going to be that much harder to get the message to them. In fact, impossible if you...
Thank you. But this is a balancing act, because sometimes you don't want to offend people, so don't do stuff that's going to offend them. But you don't want to mislead people either. So you don't offend people so that you can have the opportunity to tell them the truth. And the truth is, you don't have to be circumcised, right? But why be in somebody's face with something that's going to prevent them from hearing the message that they need to hear? That's why I really do think there are a lot of things that we don't have to do as Christians. I think it's wise that we do, right? I used to, maybe, the Bible does say we're supposed to pay our taxes. I've got a lot of good friends, though, that really make arguments that so many taxes are so excessive. I don't disagree with them at all. I really don't. I really do think a lot of taxes are excessive. Do I still think we ought to pay our taxes? Yeah. The Bible says pay your taxes, but I also think even the excessive ones sometimes, simply because we're going to put a stumbling block in front of somebody else. There are a lot of issues like that you could probably argue and say, as a Christian, I don't really have to do this. But the point is, what are other people going to think sometimes? And sometimes giving up your rights just to have a better reputation so that you can tell people about the truth, I think is an important thing. Yeah.
I'd say one of the things that can definitely be one of those is alcohol.
Oh, that's very true.
You know,
it's very true.
Even just having a simple glass of wine at dinner, if that's going to cause a problem,
yes,
I need to just back off from that thing.
Yes.
Especially if I know somebody's going to be there that's bothered by it.
Yeah. The touchy one, because, in some cultures it's coffee, and fortunately here it's not. So
yeah, for sure.
Some people, they have background that actually makes them stumble. The one, and I hesitate to bring this up, but I'll go ahead and bring it up anyway, because it's controversial in that I think sometimes it's very touchy the way we deal with street people and homelessness. And I'll just say it this way, because I don't want to open a whole can of worms. But sometimes I think the way we indiscriminately try to support street people and help homeless people is actually making the problem worse.
Yes.
But having said that, sometimes we do it because we don't want people to think that we don't care. There's a balancing act there. We really do care about people, but sometimes the best way to care about people is not to fund their lifestyle that's destructive. I feel so strongly about this that I actually think the church at large is going to have to answer to God for the homeless problem, because sometimes I think we're not making it better. We're keeping people on the street instead of actually helping getting them off the street. Okay, I opened a whole can of worms there. But to me, that's one of those examples of we've got to be concerned about our reputation, and we really do care about people. But at the end of the day, what's the best thing to do? Sometimes it's not easy. In the case here, they encourage their wisdom, and Paul listens to it. He listens to their wise advice. It's kind of like, hey, these guys have taken a special vow. And since with their vow it involves the shaving of the head, it's probably a Nazirite vow, but it doesn't say that. But most vows and the Nazirite vow they would take it for an extended period of time, maybe several months. It can be of various lengths of time. But the ceremonies at the end took a full week to complete. And it involved not only the shaving of the head, it involved offering special sacrifices. And so they said, hey, why don't you pay for that? And paying for that, you're paying for something that's extremely Jewish, right? And so everybody will know that you still support doing things like that. And he does. He has no problem with that. The problem he has is if somebody says you have to do that to be a Christian. Boy, he would never support something like that, but he's happy to support that. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he makes this statement. He says, I try to become all things to all people. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean he gets involved in going to strip joints with guys who goes to strip joints. It doesn't mean things like that. It means he builds bridges where he can. So, tries to be sensitive to people's customs, and the Jewish custom especially, right? And whatever he can to help bring people closer to the Lord. Is there were you want to make a comment?
Oh, just what you were saying about opening up the can of worms.
Yes.
We should give people a hand up, not a hand out.
I really like that statement. I really do. And one of the things that as far as can of worms go, one of the things that makes homelessness such a tricky thing is the mental health issue often involved. If you've had much opportunity to work with people that are on the street, a lot of times, sometimes it gets portrayed, the poor people, they don't have anywhere else to go. That is not true. Yeah. A lot of times there's decisions made because their brains are not, there's mental health issues involved with things like that. So by any count, it's not an easy thing, but I'm concerned, I have strong views about this, but I'm very concerned that I not have the reputation of, Mark will never help him out. Well, no, I really do care about them. And there are times when I've probably bored you with these stories before, but where we've taken food to people who said that they were just hungry. And so instead of giving money, we went out and bought food and we took it to people. And they were really upset because that's not what they wanted. They said they wanted food, but they really wanted money. And when we brought them food, we found out that they didn't really want food, right? So, and I know that's not always the case, but those kind of things happen. And I think it's better to err on the side of trying to help, right? And sometimes you do have to trust people because you can't go check them out. But end of the day, most of the way things like this are dealt with in the Bible is very relationship oriented. And it's family first, and it's people who know people. Mm-hmm. I always think that's one of the best ways to help people, find somebody who really knows them. Because if they really know them, they know, if their own brothers and sisters won't help them out, that ought to be a red flag to us, unless their brothers and sisters are jerks, right? But if they're good people and they're not helping, then maybe we ought to learn a lesson, because it's relationship based. To really help somebody, you got to really know them, right? So, I'm sorry to get off on that. Let's go back to this, verses 26. Oh boy, I ended at the wrong place tonight. Let's go verses 26 down through 29. 26 through 29.
The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is a man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law in this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I'm glad he adds that parenthetical statement, because there was this guy from Ephesus that was with Paul in the city, and so they automatically jumped to the conclusion that he must have brought him to the temple too. So they didn't have any real evidence there. But I'm glad Luke includes that, because that's the charge that's really important. The first charge, honestly, the more I look at this, the more disappointed I am, because the Jews here are not talking about God. What they're really upset about is our Jewish customs. That's what really bothers them. And at the end of the day, the Jewish customs were supposed to be to honor God. And that's not what they're talking about. Having said that, the charge that sticks here is bringing a Gentile in. We've discovered, archaeologists have discovered back in the early 1900s, but then later, 1970s, 1980s, we've actually found 2 different stones with inscriptions on them in the temple area that have detailed comments or detailed instructions that any Gentile who passes this point has pretty much forfeited their life. It was not just a felony, it was the Jews, which by the way, this is interesting because the Jews had to bring Jesus to Pilate because they weren't allowed to carry out capital punishment. That's true most of the time, but this is one of the exceptions the Romans made. If a Gentile actually crossed that line and went into their territory, the Romans wanted to keep rule over all the territories, but one of the ways they did that is allow religious freedoms. And so this is one of the things that Rome allowed. So the Romans had a tower. Actually, Herod the Great built this tower, but the Romans ended up using this tower for their barracks that stood 100 feet in the air. It's a huge tower. And it was adjacent to this very area. Why would the Romans use that? Because the Jews had a reputation. And so they had, we'll see this next week when we come back to this, when they send in the officers to the rescue, they're going to mention centurions in the plural. So they sent several hundred soldiers in to calm down the crowd, because the crowd here is going to work themselves up into a frenzy at these words that a Gentile has actually gone into the court of the Jews, where only Jews were allowed. And that's the charge that they're going to stick with, and that's going to get everybody riled up. Let me see, was there anything else I wanted to comment on here? I think that's it. We left off at verse 29. Let's go ahead and get verses 30 all the way down through 36. 30 through 36.
Okay. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar.
Yes.
He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what had been done, what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great, he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him."
Yes. This kind of sounds like crucify him,
Yeah.
crucify him, doesn't it? And when people in the crowd, some said one thing, said some, and others said something else, doesn't that make you think
Sounds
of
like
the riot they had at Ephesus? It said most people didn't even know why they were there, but they were still shouting.
Yeah.
They were still worked up. That's kind of the mob mentality here, right? Okay, in verse 32, when it says his officers there, that's really the Greek word for centurions. So the plural here, he's got several commanders of hundreds. So that Rome knew what to expect. In fact, this was, do you remember which feast this was? He wanted to get back in time for...
11, no.
This is the Pentecost feast. Yeah. So this is one of the major feasts. And Rome, Passover, Pentecost, the major feasts, they would send thousands of extra troops into Jerusalem. They always had troops there, but they'd have thousands extra. That's why Pilate would be in Jerusalem at the time of the Passover for Jesus' trial, because he lived up in Caesarea. He didn't want to be in Jerusalem, but he had to be in Jerusalem because it was a major feast. So you have all these extra Roman soldiers there. They're up in the barracks watching things. When it said all this happened and the crowd swarmed around him and then they shut the gate, Well, what we're talking about here is they brought him outside of that area where only Jews were allowed, right? And it's kind of like they shut the gate so nobody else could get in. And so they're in this called the courtyard of Gentiles, where the Gentiles are actually allowed. And that's where the Roman soldiers would come. When the Roman soldiers came, you might think to yourself, well, why are they arresting Paul without figuring out what's going on? Well, they can see that he's the epicenter of the chaos here. And so when it says they have a soldier on either side, in all likelihood, what happened was he's chained to two different soldiers, right? To protect him as well as to calm the crowd down. Well, it doesn't work as far as crowding the crowd. And so they literally have to lift him up and out over the crowd just to get him out of there. But that's not the way it's going to end. We've got a couple minutes. Let's go ahead and finish off the chapter here, verse 37 through 40.
Yes. Yeah.
As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic.
Okay, do you have a footnote by Aramaic?
Or possibly Hebrew.
Yeah, in all likelihood, it's Hebrew. I think the Greek term here is their native tongue, and so they're guessing it's either Aramaic or Hebrew. The reason NIV goes with Aramaic is that was the common spoken language, right? But their native tongue is more native to them would be Hebrew. It's just not everybody spoke Hebrew, but Hebrew was, true Jews spoke Hebrew. That was kind of like their whoa. And that's the very impression Paul wants to make. So Paul is fluent in Greek and in Hebrew and in Aramaic. But in all likelihood, he's going to speak to them in the Hebrew tongue so he can impress upon them, hey, I'm as Jew as any Jew's ever been a Jew. And his point is, if you're really a Jew, you need to become a Christian. But he wants to impress on them that he's really a Jew, right? So just to back up and make these comments, though, one of the things that they want to take him into the barracks, but he's speaking to them in Greek, which really impresses the centurion here, the officer. And the reason he's impressed is it is the universal language, but it's also the language of the upper classes. So it's kind of like, oh, I'm dealing with somebody important here. He had assumed there was this guy that we know very little about, but about 3 to 4 years before this, led a revolt, and he was from Egypt. So he expected him to speak Egyptian or some other dialect, but he sure didn't expect Greek, right? This Egyptian who led this revolt and a whole bunch of people died, he got out of there. And so the Romans, it's kind of like he was on their most wanted list, right? Thinking he may gather up some more people and lead another revolt. And so he's automatically assuming it must be this guy because it's a revolt at feast time. But he's not. And he impresses on him from where he was born, which is another thing that most of us don't put a lot of stock in. But the resumes of the ancient world were not your work record. It was your family and where you were brought up. Mm-hmm. And so if he could say that, where he was brought up, that was in his favor. And if he could talk any about his lineage, which he will talk about later on, right? But he's also trained by a guy named Gamaliel, which was huge. It was huge. And that's going to go a long way with the Jews. In fact, everything's going to go well until he mentions the Gentiles. Yeah. As soon as he mentions the Gentiles, they're done listening to him, right? So anyway, we've got it up to the point where Paul is ready to tell them about his conversion experience a second time. And that's what we'll pick up with next week then. Questions, comments, observations? Yes?
When he says a citizen of no ordinary city, is he implying a Roman citizen too?
I think so.
I would if I were him.
Yeah, and he will make that point later. I'm glad you said that because that's huge to the Romans. I mean, remember back in Philippi when they found out that he was a Roman citizen, they were like, oh, You know, I'm so sorry. Can I dust off your, can I give you an escort out here? Please don't tell on us.
First, and then said, what are the charges?
Yeah, right. Which I'll let you know how we were talking about this in men's study last night. Many are the occasions when somebody's finally handed over to a jailer or to the soldiers or whatever. It's kind of like, well, if they handed you over to us, you obviously are guilty, so we're going to mistreat you any way we want to mistreat you, right? Because it's not just the Jews who are mocking Jesus, it's the soldiers who really didn't even know Jesus, right? But they went ahead and mocked him anyway because he's a criminal. We've got him.
What do you call it? Guilty
By association or location or
no, guilty even after proven innocent.
Yes. Yes. Wow. Good.